So what happens then when you experience a significant loss and it is not recognized by even your closest friends and family, let alone understood, right? How do you work through it when you don't feel that you have the permission to grieve in the first place? That is the unique and very complicated grief of a parent caring for a child with neurobehavioral conditions with these intense needs. Hi there, and welcome to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine, and I am a therapist, parent coach, and educator who supports parents that are raising children, teens, and young adults with brain-based differences and challenging behavioral symptoms. If you are a parent or caregiver of a child who has intense, confusing, relentless, or sometimes even scary behaviors, you are in the right place, and I am so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, it's Eileen Devine here. Thanks for tuning in again to another episode of the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I just returned from a wonderful few days facilitating workshops for a group of parents, all of whom have kids who are neurodivergent in some way, who have tricky, challenging behaviors. And it was such a sweet reminder for me of how lucky I am to do this work and spend time with, be in conversation with so many amazing, really just good-hearted people who care so deeply about their kids, these kids who struggle in some pretty big ways. I had already outlined the podcast episode that I have for you today before spending my time with them, but being with them and in conversation with them really reinforced for me what an important topic this is that we're going to talk about today. And it just affirmed my decision to try and tackle this experience, really, that I think all of us share in one degree or another, an experience that can feel really heavy and just really hard for so many of the parents that I work with. So that's what we're going to talk about today, this experience of grief and loss as parents who have kids who struggle. And like I said, it's a hard and heavy topic to talk about, but so necessary. And I'll dive into some more of my thoughts on why we need to keep coming back to this topic as hard as it is and why it's so necessary for us to be mindful of it. So this is something that after working with parents for over a decade now, I've really come to believe that it's nearly universal for parents of complex kids who have such intense needs. And again, that the conversations I had over this past week with parents, it only confirmed that for me. But what it also confirmed for me is that we don't talk enough about it. And that as parents, this part of your unique parenting experience is rarely acknowledged. It's hardly ever talked about. And there's so much suffering that results from us never talking about it. I think there's understandable reasons why we, meaning the societal we, why we don't talk about this aspect of parenting kids like yours and mine. And again, we'll get into that too in this episode. But I first want to begin with what grief and loss is so that we have this common understanding of what we're talking about here. So I personally love the way that Dr. Brene Brown, she has a book called Rising Strong, which, by the way, is a great book. I highly recommend it. The way that Brene Brown talks about loss and grief, because I think her description is especially applicable to parents of kids with intense behaviors and intense needs. So this is how she describes it. She says, grief is like surfing. Sometimes you feel steady and you're able to ride the waves. And other times the surf comes crashing down on you, pushing you so far underwater that you're sure you will drown. I have sat with many parents who describe this happening in their life. Things aren't easy, but they're manageable. They're tired, but they're able to persevere. And then bam, this wave of grief and sadness hits them seemingly out of nowhere and just pulls them underwater, and they feel like they're going to drown. It's lonely, and it is so, so hard. Brene Brown also defines grief for us in this really clear, tangible ways. She talks about it as having 3 foundational elements. And so as I go through each of these 3 foundational elements of grief, I want you to just take a moment to think about how each of these might apply to you and your parenting experience. So the first is loss. The loss of what could have been, but never will be. So the loss of what you thought parenting would look like, the loss of what you thought family time and togetherness would look like, the loss of what you imagined was possible for your child, but maybe now you see their life might look different than you had originally imagined. The loss of what you imagined your later years would look like, the loss of what could have been, but you now know will likely never be. The second is longing. So longing for what will not be, and for meaning and for understanding of what is. I know I've experienced that wave of grief wash over me, pull me under at times, when I have this moment of realization that something that I didn't even know I longed for or even cared about related to my daughter isn't going to be possible. And the sadness that can descend upon us when we are in those moments. So longing for what will not be and longing for meaning and understanding of what is. And the third foundational element that she talks about is feeling lost. So always feeling the need to reorient ourselves to our world, to our emotional selves. This is the journey you and I find ourselves on, isn't it? Or at least it did feel that way for me at one time. Feeling lost. What is happening here? What can I do about it? Nothing seems to work. Why is this happening? And feeling more and more hopeless about finding solutions or answers and losing yourself slowly in that process. Parenting kids with complex needs and challenging behaviors is disorienting. It requires a completely different paradigm, a completely different approach. And at least at the beginning of learning to parent them differently, many parents describe feeling lost and this need to reorient themselves to the world as it is, right? Not as they imagined it would be or wish it to be, but as it is. And reorienting themselves to their own experience at the same time. So, man, that's hard. It's really, really hard work. With all of that being said, it's no wonder that most of us do whatever we can to keep grief at arm's length. We work very hard to not acknowledge it or deal with it because of the sadness and the darkness that it can bring. It is in some ways easier and definitely more accepted by our larger society for us to just be angry rather than being sad. I think this is especially true for men in our society. Most men, and I know this is a generalization, are told directly or indirectly from a very early age not to be sad, that it's a sign of weakness. And so when they feel that loss and that grief, it often manifests as anger and irritability because society can tolerate a man being really angry, but has a really hard time with a man who's devastatingly sad or overwhelmed by their grief. So that, of course, happens to women too, but I want to highlight how especially prevalent it is for men. When I'm working with parents, whether it's a mom or a dad, and there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of resentment, I'm always looking for the signs of grief and loss that are buried underneath that anger or that rage or that resentment because it's almost always there. A parent's grief can also show up in some other tricky ways, right? It can show up as jealousy. So, for example, when you feel yourself becoming really jealous or maybe even resentful of your sibling's experience of being a parent, which is just more typical. And it's what you expected your parenting experience would be like, but you don't have it. And when you watch them parent their kids, it just seems so effortless and so easy, right? And you want to be happy for them. And you know it's not their fault that your experience isn't what their experience is. But you just can't help being resentful and jealous of them. And I have to tell you, I am biased, but I work with the most kind-hearted and caring parents. And when this comes up, this jealousy and this resentment of basically, how easy other people may have it, they feel really awful about thinking these things and for feeling those things. But when we talk about it and how it's connected to their grief experience, and that self-compassion is really what they need in that moment, not self-judgment. That is where healing can begin, right? Moving through that grief. That's when that healing and coming out the other side of it can really start to take shape. One last way that I've seen grief show up is through feelings of guilt and self-judgment, that you have grief and loss related to this complex but beautiful, tender-hearted child of yours. It's really hard to hold both at the same time, to acknowledge that both of these things can be true, where you love your child immensely and you also have grief and you experience loss related to being their parent. So it goes without saying that grief is an exceptionally personal process, and it can show up in different ways for different people. Yet at the same time, society really dictates general rules around that process. So for example, when we lose someone, often through death, it's understood by society that we will likely have periods of tearfulness. We will likely have feelings of sadness and depression, that we may need to take a temporary leave of absence from work, that we may not be ourselves, right? And close friends and family, even acquaintances at times, will offer condolences in the way of meals or cards or flowers or offering to grocery shop or babysit our kids or cover for us at work. We may grieve in our own way and in our own time, but it is universally accepted and acknowledged that we have the right to grieve the loss we've experienced, and that we will likely need some level of support to help us heal, to help us get through it. So what happens then when you experience a significant loss and it is not recognized by even your closest friends and family, let alone understood, right? How do you work through it when you don't feel that you have the permission to grieve in the first place? That is the unique and very complicated grief of a parent caring for a child with neurobehavioral conditions with these intense needs. This is what we define as disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is loss that is not socially sanctioned, it is not openly acknowledged, it is not recognized by others, and it is not publicly mourned. That's the definition of disenfranchised grief. And if you delve into the research that's been done on disenfranchised grief, one of the few populations that has been researched and identified as experiencing high levels of disenfranchised grief are parents of children with disabilities. When I reflect on my own experience and the experience of many, many, many families I've worked with, this definitely rings true. Parents have articulated time and time again these specific instances or periods of time that were filled with intense grief because of what they came to realize through their parenting experience is lost or will never be, compounded by the loneliness felt when those around them were completely unaware of this very intense, very personal experience that was happening. Or situations where maybe they did show some vulnerability and they shared with someone close to them this grief and this loss that they were experiencing, but it fell flat, right? The response from the other person left them feeling unheard or exposed or misunderstood, and they think, I will never do that again, right? It can be letting go of and the loss of the idea that our child will someday grow into what we had in our minds as an independent adult, right? The grief and loss can be the sadness that overtakes us when faced with the reality that social gatherings and family vacations may never be typical or quote unquote easy. The realization that your child simply won't have the typical friendships that most kids their age experience, that friendships and social life is going to look really different for them than what you had imagined or hoped for. It is the grief that creeps up when you realize that they've never been invited to a birthday party, right? Or even a play date. Disenfranchised grief is the feeling of loss when those developmental stages kind of pass you by, right? They're not met, or common milestones in a typical child's life, such as graduation from high school, for example, pass our kids by. It's the loss of what you imagined your future as, say, a retired, no kids in the home life may look like. This applies to so many of the parents I support, but the people who always come to mind immediately for me when I think about this aspect of loss are the grandparents that I've worked with who have found themselves in the position of caring for and sometimes adopting their grandchildren. And this one is especially true for them. They didn't imagine that their older years or their retired life would look the way that it does now, right? And it usually means that there's this grief and loss around what's happening with their own child that required them to step in the first place, right? There's so much grief and loss in that. So this unrecognized or disenfranchised grief, it's the loss of friendships that we experience due to the reality that some people, no matter how hard they try or how hard we try, they simply can't reach a place of understanding and full acceptance of who our child is and what their living with a brain-based difference and sometimes challenging behavioral symptoms means. So that diminished social life that can accompany this parenting experience. This is also a big point to understand about disenfranchised grief. When a loved one passes away, the intensity of the grief often fades with time, right? So the feelings of loss and depression and sadness, it may flare up at times when we're reminded that our loved one is no longer with us, such as birthdays or anniversaries, special holidays, and those around us acknowledge this and expect this of us. They are there for us. And that's how the healing happens, in the company of other people who validate our experience and support us through it. When your grief and loss as a parent of a complex and often challenging, I know, child is not recognized in the same way, it intensifies those feelings of isolation, and there's this deepening sadness. Not to mention that the grief we're talking about here isn't a one-time event. It can come up repeatedly, right, throughout our child's life, making it even more essential to having access to your ongoing support, because that is where the healing takes place, in the company of other people or another person, right? So what can we do differently in order to not get stuck in the grief that we may be experiencing as a parent? Because when we get stuck there with seemingly no relief or no way out, that's when things can get really, really hard, right? Emotionally, physically, spiritually. So the first step is to recognize that that's what you are experiencing, that what you are in the messy middle of is grief and loss, that irritability or that resentment, that sadness, that anger, there's a high likelihood of it being tied in some way to unacknowledged, unprocessed grief related to your experience as a parent. And then giving yourself permission to recognize that this is a process you're going through and giving yourself the space to process it in healthy, productive ways. I know that that is easier said than done, but I want you to know that mourning that loss that you're experiencing, it does not make you a bad or selfish parent. It makes you human, and you can have intense love for your child and also allow yourself to grieve. Both can be true. And that may feel impossible for you to do on your own because of the overwhelm that it brings, right? That wave crashing over you and getting pulled underwater before you even know what's happening. So tolerating it, sitting with it can be really, really hard. This is when you might think about getting your own support, right? To help you move through it. So speaking of support, finding a supportive group of people who have a similar experience can be hugely beneficial for all kinds of reasons. But this is a big one. That is why I created the Resilience Room community over 6 years ago now, because I had one parent after another talking about their experience of this disenfranchised grief, feeling like nobody else in the world, except for me, because that's who they were talking to, understood their experience. I was like, that's simply not true. I meet with parents all the time who have a very similar experience that they described to me. So I wanted to create a community so that there is never a parent who feels alone in their grief. There's always an opportunity for them to be in community, always an opportunity for them to heal. So the last thing that I'll say on this topic, because I know we've covered a lot of ground already, is related specifically to those of you who are in parenting partnerships. So if you are partnered with someone who you parent with, one thing that I just want to highlight related to grief and loss is the very common experience that two parents in the same household may be both experiencing a lot of grief and a lot of loss, but processing it and responding to it in very different ways. And what that leaves those two people feeling like, who are in the same experience with the same child in the same household, it leaves them feeling like they are on two completely different planets, right? They don't understand where this other person is coming from. And most of the time, they are just managing and responding to the same experience, grief and loss, in different ways. So what can happen is that in that moment, when these two people need each other the most, there's disconnection because they don't understand what's happening with the other person. The response to it is different. And so they feel like, this person has no idea what I'm going through. They're not experiencing this. So in that moment, when they need each other the most, there's growing distance. So if there's an acknowledgement, a discussion about this grief and this loss that each of them are experiencing, and an acknowledgement and understanding that it is different in terms of the way they are responding to it and processing it and moving through it, that can be really helpful in coming back together and then supporting each other through it. Alrighty. I appreciate you sticking with me through this episode. I know that it's a very, very heavy topic, but it's also so necessary to bring it to the surface, right? To highlight it, to really talk about it, given how prevalent it is and how alone I know many of you feel in it. Okay, so take care of yourself today. Give yourself a little extra TLC, whatever that means for you, as you reflect on how this all might apply to you and your unique parenting journey. As always, thanks for being here. And until next time, take care. Hey, I was hoping I could ask for a really quick favor before we say goodbye. If you enjoy this podcast and you find the information that I have to share valuable to you as a parent or a provider, I would really appreciate if you took just a few minutes to provide this podcast with a 5-star review and a quick comment with how this information has positively impacted you. It is the number one way for me to reach more parents like you and I, that could really use some hope and some support as they continue to do their best to parent their child who lives with a brain-based difference and challenging behavioral symptoms. Thanks so much.